Once the face of American grit and cinematic glory, Sylvester Stallone now finds himself reduced to memes and punchlines, a living legend caught between reverence and ridicule. How did the same Hollywood that once crowned him the king of action now turn him into a caricature of his own legacy? This isn't just the story of one man's career, it's the story of how fame, culture, and corporate filmmaking can twist the meaning of a hero until he becomes his own parody. For those who don't remember, Stallone wasn't just an actor, he was a symbol. The man who gave us Rocky and Rambo defined an entire generation's idea of perseverance, masculinity, and heart. Yet somewhere between box office hits, internet culture, and Hollywood's obsession with self-awareness, his image began to shift. Today, the same toughness that once inspired millions is mocked as outdated, exaggerated, or even laughable. Sylvester Stallone's story begins far from red carpets or fame. Born in New York City in 1946, his early years were anything but glamorous. A difficult birth left him with partial paralysis on one side of his face, slurred speech, and drooping lips, features that would later become part of his unmistakable screen identity. But as a young man, that face meant rejection. Casting directors turned him away repeatedly. He worked odd jobs, even sleeping in bus stations, just to stay close to the dream. Then came Rocky. Broke, unknown, and desperate, Stallone wrote the script in just a few days after watching a boxing match that inspired him. When studios offered to buy it, he refused unless he could play the lead himself. It was a gamble, and it changed Hollywood history. Rocky hit theaters in 1976 like a thunderclap, earning 10 Oscar nominations and winning 3, including Best Picture. The story of an underdog boxer mirrored Stallone's own life, and audiences saw something real in him, not just a character, but a man who embodied resilience itself. The success of Rocky didn't just make Stallone famous, it made him a symbol of the American dream. He became the cinematic everyman who refused to quit, who fought through pain, poverty, and mockery to stand tall. His name became synonymous with grit. And for a time, it felt like Sylvester Stallone was untouchable, a man who could go from the streets of Philadelphia to the very top of Hollywood, powered only by belief and a stubborn heart that refused to lose. By the early 1980s, Sylvester Stallone wasn't just a movie star, he was a cultural force. Rocky had turned into a phenomenon, and with Rambo, he became something larger than life. These weren't just characters, they were brands. Rambo, First Blood Part 2 exploded at the box office, pulling in hundreds of millions worldwide, and the Rocky sequels continued to dominate theaters with every release. Stallone was commanding salaries that rivaled anyone in Hollywood, and studios saw him as a guaranteed return, a living investment in muscle and myth. The 1980s were his empire. Posters of Stallone's sweat-soaked, defiant face decorated bedrooms around the world. Toy lines, video games, lunchboxes, everything bore his likeness. Kids didn't just want to watch him, they wanted to be him. His movies spoke to a certain spirit of the time, the self-made hero who fought alone, who didn't need saving because he was the savior. America saw itself in him, and so did audiences abroad. Even foreign markets that rarely embraced Hollywood icons made exceptions for Stallone. But behind the triumphs was a man who knew the weight of expectation. To be Sylvester Stallone in that era meant being trapped in your own legend. Studios didn't want the writer or the thinker, they wanted the fighter. Each hit movie chained him tighter to his persona, the grunting, bleeding, never-die soldier or boxer who always found redemption through pain. His fame was enormous, but it came with a price, and though few could see it then, the very image that made him powerful would later become the thing Hollywood turned against him. By the 1990s, the first cracks began to show. The same culture that had once worshipped his strength started to find it funny. Late-night comedians and sketch shows began imitating his slurred speech and over-the-top intensity. Parody films like Hot Shots and countless TV skits exaggerated his voice, his walk, his machismo. Even Stallone himself leaned into it, appearing in self-referential cameos that poked fun at his image. Movies like Stop or My Mom Will Shoot were meant to show range but instead made him a target for mockery. It was a strange shift. The man who once represented raw emotion and sincerity was now seen as a cartoon. Hollywood had entered its ironic era, where sincerity was weakness and self-awareness was the new cool. For Stallone, whose entire appeal had been rooted in heart-on-sleeve honesty, that change cut deep. Audiences who once cheered him on now laughed at him, not with him. And the most painful part? He had helped create the culture that now turned on him. By becoming so big, so mythic, so unmistakably Stallone, he made himself easy to caricature. What was once inspiration was now imitation, and for the first time, the hero of the underdog story began to look like the punchline of his own legend. The moment Stallone stopped being simply a legend and started becoming a joke was not a single event. It was a sequence of industry choices and cultural shifts that aligned like bad dominoes. First, studios began treating his name as a safe brand rather than an artist to be cultivated. That produced a steady stream of sequels and quick-turn projects that prioritized shelf life over substance. Franchise fatigue set in. Scripts were greenlit on the promise of a familiar face rather than a fresh idea, sequels were patched together by committees, and weak writing turned once iconic characters into hollow caricatures. Titles that should have been careful reinventions instead read like cash grabs, and the audience, who had once forgiven rough edges for authenticity, started to feel cheated. Next came marketing misfires that actively rewired his public image. Rather than framing Stallone as a complex, evolving performer, some campaigns leaned hard into nostalgia or irony, packaging him as a throwback novelty to be winked at. Trailers and posters began to trade on the safe joke, the gruff old-timer still swinging a gun, rather than the emotional core that made his early work resonate. When promotional edits reduce a performance to a punchline or a memeable moment, the cultural shorthand shifts. People stop expecting depth and start expecting a gag. A few high-profile ad spots and trailer cuts played straight into that rebranding, and in doing so they helped turn serious roles into setups for late-night comedians. The rise of internet culture and meme-making accelerated what the studios had started. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, viral clips and late-night sketches amplified the caricatures. A single out-of-context line, an exaggerated facial expression, or an over-emoted delivery could live forever on social media. Looped, remixed, and captioned until the nuance was gone. Comedy shows and sketch writers leaned on those viral bits because it was low-hanging fruit. The audience already knew the joke. Once a performer's moments become meme fodder, the public conversation narrows. Complex careers are reduced to a handful of repeating frames. But this collapse didn't happen without Stallone's own hand in it. Over the years he occasionally embraced self-parody, doing cameos and self-aware bits that winked at his legend. Self-deprecation can be a powerful tool. It humanizes and disarms, but it's a double-edged sword. In Stallone's case, leaning into the joke sometimes blurred the line between playful reinvention and surrender. Cameos intended as clever nods often read as confirmations. If he's laughing at himself, maybe we should too. The more he gamified his own myth, the more the industry and the public felt licensed to treat him as a comic figure rather than a serious artist. The forensic pattern is clear. Studios commodified the Stallone brand, marketing reframed it as nostalgia or parody, digital culture distilled him into repeatable clips, and self-parody erased the last defenses of gravitas. Individually, none of these forces might have been fatal. Together, they created a feedback loop that rewired expectations. What began as towering cinematic myth became, piece by piece, an image optimized for jokes. The tragedy is not that Stallone was mocked, many public figures are, but that an entire creative system, from greenlight meetings to social feeds, systematically undermined the very qualities that once made him great. The descent wasn't sudden, it was gradual erosion disguised as relevance. By the mid-2000s, critics who once praised Stallone's grit began to shift their tone. Reviews that once admired his emotional weight now spoke in past tense, describing him as a relic of the 80s. Films that might have earned respect for their craftsmanship were now filtered through irony. Even strong performances were framed with surprise, as though audiences needed permission to take him seriously again. Box office numbers mirrored that perception. The mid-tier action films that once opened strong began to struggle against younger franchises. Where a Stallone release once meant event cinema, it now meant curiosity, an echo of a bygone era. Critics weren't the only ones changing. For a generation raised on viral humor and recycled nostalgia, Stallone wasn't Rocky Balboa, the American dream personified. He was the guy with the funny voice in memes, the punchline to TikTok edits and YouTube compilations. Younger audiences encountered his legacy through mockery before ever seeing his artistry. Even his cinematic identity, the earnestness, the raw sincerity, became ammunition for satire. Internet compilations of his emotional scenes, often stripped of their context, turned sincere moments into objects of ridicule. Yo Adrian, once a cultural triumph, became a soundbite for parody. Late-night talk shows and comedy skits recycled his image as shorthand for outdated masculinity. Award circuits also turned quiet. Once an Oscar-nominated writer and actor, Stallone's later projects were overlooked entirely, no matter how ambitious. The industry that once hailed him as proof that grit and self-belief could conquer Hollywood now treated him as nostalgia fuel. By the time The Expendables became his biggest calling card again, it wasn't a celebration, it was a collective wink at what used to be. The man who once embodied resilience had become a living meme, and that transformation said as much about changing culture as it did about him. Ironically, the ridicule didn't come from failure but from longevity. Stallone kept working, and in doing so, kept exposing himself to a world that had already decided his image belonged to the past. His survival, his refusal to disappear, made him both admirable and absurd in the public eye. It was the price of staying visible in an industry that values novelty more than legacy. As the ridicule spread, the effects became tangible. The industry, always pragmatic, began adjusting its perception of Stallone's value. Scripts for leading man roles, once written with him in mind, dwindled. Offers shifted toward cameos, self-referential parodies, or ensemble projects where his name added nostalgic flavor rather than creative weight. Casting directors began describing him as a presence rather than a performer, a polite rebranding of irrelevance. Commercial studios leaned into this perception, pitching him projects that traded entirely on his mythology: exaggerated violence, recycled one-liners, predictable comebacks. It wasn't just typecasting anymore, it was containment. Hollywood had found a way to use his image without risking his depth. And with each ironic role, the possibility of serious reinvention slipped further away. The emotional toll wasn't invisible. Stallone spoke in interviews about feeling underestimated, about the frustration of being seen only through a nostalgic lens. His social media presence, often reflective and tinged with melancholy, revealed a man aware of the narrative but unwilling to surrender to it. He tried, at times, to wrestle back control, writing and directing more personal projects, reviving Rocky through Creed, a film that finally reconnected him with the emotional truth of his origins. It was a rare moment where Hollywood and the audience remembered why he mattered. Still, that redemption was temporary. For every Creed, there were half a dozen projects that reinforced the stereotype. The tension between self-parody and sincerity became the defining feature of his late career. Hollywood had boxed him in, but the public sealed the lid with laughter. Empathy demands we see this not just as career decline but as identity loss, the erosion of how a man defines himself through his art. Stallone's story became a cautionary tale for aging stars in an industry that eats its heroes once they stop being useful. He wasn't destroyed by failure, but by survival in a system that confuses endurance with obsolescence. It's easy to point fingers at Hollywood or the internet, but the truth, as always, is layered. Stallone wasn't destroyed by malice. He was outpaced by time. The industry that once built mythic heroes shifted toward flawed, ironic protagonists, the kind that don't fit in a headband or lift tanks. Audiences changed too. The same viewers who once idolized toughness began craving vulnerability and diversity, leaving Stallone's brand of masculinity looking dated, even cartoonish. Then there's Stallone's own complicity. His loyalty to sequels, nostalgia-driven scripts, and control over franchises like Rambo and The Expendables sometimes trapped him in creative repetition. Instead of redefining himself like Clint Eastwood or reinventing like Keanu Reeves, he doubled down on what had worked decades earlier. That choice may have preserved his name, but it froze his evolution. Meanwhile, the meme era did what it always does: flatten complexity into comedy. Clips that once inspired were re-edited for laughs, interviews turned into sound bites. It wasn't malicious, just indifferent, a reflection of how fast cultural memory moves now. So yes, studios and media amplified the fall, but Stallone's career also collided with a generational shift that no single actor could control. His story isn't a failure of one man or one system. It's what happens when nostalgia outpaces reinvention. Preserving Stallone's legacy wasn't impossible. It only required timing and restraint. The smartest path might have been radical selectivity, fewer projects, more purpose. Instead of leading another explosion-heavy sequel, he could have followed the path of aging icons who reinvented themselves through prestige cinema, minimalist roles, independent directors, festival circuits. A partnership with filmmakers like Denis Villeneuve or Darren Aronofsky could have reframed his intensity into gravitas rather than parody. His team, too, could have managed his image more carefully. Limiting meme exposure, steering interviews toward introspection instead of nostalgia, and focusing on legacy documentaries or writing projects would have humanized him again. A curated comeback, not a nostalgic echo. Even the studios had options. With smarter marketing, positioning Stallone as a survivor of Hollywood evolution rather than a remnant of it, they could have turned aging into strength, not spectacle. There was a version of his story that ended not in mockery but in mastery. The problem isn't that he got old, it's that no one, including him, planned for what aging in Hollywood really means. When the dust settles, blame can be divided but not erased. Studios, 7 out of 10, for chasing nostalgia cash over creative evolution. Media, 8 out of 10, for amplifying mockery into myth. Stallone himself, 5 out of 10, for clinging to comfort when reinvention was possible. Together, they turned an icon into irony. The verdict? Not a tragedy, but a cautionary tale of what happens when the hero doesn't adapt before the story moves on. At the end of it all, Sylvester Stallone remains more than a meme, more than a punchline, and certainly more than a relic. His story, from writing Rocky in a cramped apartment to becoming one of Hollywood's defining icons, still carries weight far beyond the internet's short attention span. The same world that now laughs at his voice once stood and cheered for his willpower. That's the duality of fame. It builds you into something immortal, then cages you inside that image forever. Maybe Stallone's legacy was never truly killed. Maybe it was rewritten by a culture that doesn't know how to handle sincerity anymore. We live in an age where irony sells better than authenticity, where emotion becomes content, and heroes are remembered through filters and captions. But beneath the noise, the heart that wrote Rocky still beats, stubborn, resilient, unbroken. So the question isn't whether they turned Stallone into a joke. It's whether we, the audience, forgot how to take heroes seriously. Did they kill his image, or did we just stop believing in it? So what do you think? Did Hollywood and the internet turn Sylvester Stallone into a joke, or did he choose the laughs himself? Drop your verdict below. Studio guilty, internet guilty, Stallone guilty, or none of the above. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and vote in the poll, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into another legend who went from myth to meme.